Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Technology, Risk and Gambling webinar series presented by the Brain and Mind Center at the University of Sydney. My name is Kahlil Philander. I'm an assistant professor at Washington State University. And today we have another fantastic seminar on the docket today. But before I pass things on to my colleague, Sally Gainsbury, let me just go through a couple housekeeping things. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to plug those into the YouTube comments section, and we'll loop around to them as we go through the webinar. And if you have any other ideas or speakers that you might want to see on the seminar series in the future, please feel free to reach out to us either personally on our own email addresses or through the website. There's a place that you can input any ideas that you have for future shows. But without further delay, allow me to pass on the conversation to Sally Gainsbury. Sally.
Thank you very much, Kahlil. So I'm Sally Gainsbury. I'm a professor in the School of Psychology at the University of Sydney, and I'm director of the Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic and leader of the Technology Addiction Team. So the Technology Risk and Webinar series was born originally out of COVID, of the opportunities that we didn't have to hear from leading thinkers and particularly early career researchers in the diverse audience that we were missing. And we're just thrilled that it's been such a popular and interesting and for us, highly engaging series to run, and that we continue to have so much content we're interested in covered on these topics of technology, risk and gambling. And I'm really delighted. This was one of the first topics I wanted to have in this season, and I've managed to get two absolute experts to speak to us on the topic of behavioural science and design principles today. So a huge thank you to them both who are staying up very late in the UK and Malta. To Dr. Maris Catania, who is a consultant who's previously been doing work and continues to do research with Kindred in the area of responsible gambling. And Aisling Ní Chonaire, who's the head of the Gambling Research and Policy Unit at the Behavioural Insights Team, which is a new specific unit of this group, obviously working in behavioural sciences to focus on the topic of gambling in recognition of the importance of design and looking at consumer protection mechanisms. So thank you again for joining us so late. So please take advantage, anyone watching, of the live chat. You do not often get the opportunity to have two such great experts in the room. So feel free to start asking them questions early before we run out of time. So I might ask you, Aisling, because you're the head of this new unit that's obviously focused on using behavioural science, and you've used behavioural science across so many different disciplines and topics. How did it come about that you decided gambling needed a specific focus?
Good question. So I suppose we go back quite a number of years so maybe stepping back a bit. I work for a company called the Behavioural Insights Team, and what we try and do is think of ways that you can improve services, processes, policy to make them better interact with how people work, for how people interact with them. And we've worked across the policy spectrum, so huge amount of work in health behaviours, huge amount of work in education, for example. And it was a number of years ago where we realised that actually around gambling, there's a huge opportunity there to think about how you could better understand the behavioural aspects to reduce gambling harms. So we originally worked on a bit of a mixed methods project about, I think it was 7 years ago at this point. And one of the interesting things that we did as part of that was we did some mystery shopping. So spending some time on operator platforms to better understand what the design features were, what was the online choice architecture, again, to, I suppose, experience what it's like to play on the platforms, etc., but also to explore that point around choice and where choices might be framed in a certain way to influence decisions, etc., that might encourage people to spend a bit more money or more time, for example, on platforms. So that was a fascinating piece of research to be part of in the first instance. And what that inspired us was to identify a few areas where we could trial or propose some experiments. So what we did was we worked with a few of the large operators in the UK to run some experiments. Firstly, looking at, could we encourage more people to sign up to gambling management tools? So it's things like your deposit limits, things like your reality checks. And what we found was, even if you did encourage people to sign up to these tools that didn't necessarily have an impact on how much they would spend or how much time they spent on the platforms. So I suppose we went back to the drawing board a little bit to say, actually, should we be thinking about how we redesign the platforms, redesign the tools to make them more effective? And that was one of many, I suppose, thoughts that we've had over the past few years, and thinking about, there feels like actually there's a huge opportunity here to explore kind of the design of games and features to reduce gambling harm. So just over a year ago, almost a year and a half ago at this point, we established the Gambling Policy and Research Unit. So we have a team of 6 staff exploring all the many aspects of kind of the gambling ecosystem, from operator platforms to ads and marketing, treatment support, but also, I suppose, the role of financial services, just to give you, I suppose, a bit of an overview of all the aspects of it. But I might pause there.
Yeah, absolutely. And for due disclosure, I am a member of the advisory committee at the international group that, so I have some insights into the way that you're thinking about where do you target? It's such a broad area, and I'm really glad you talked through some of the areas, because yes, it's design of the specific site, but it's also the comms and the marketing, it's the products, and then it's external stakeholders. And you're working as an independent organisation with funding from the UK government, if that's correct. So you're not doing a commission project that the industry have asked you to do. They haven't come and said, can you do this for us? Although I believe that obviously with their cooperation, some of them are. So I guess that's an interesting point of how do you decide, do you go for low-hanging fruit? Do you go for the easiest fixes? Do you go for the most impact? And that contrast between a lot of the behavioural science, as you say, it's really about sort of nudging choices, and it's really leaving the behaviour to the individuals. It's not a major sort of blow like a restriction or some kind of policy that's imposing a behavioural constraint on someone. So where do you start with making a decision of what's going to be the most impactful or easiest? How do you start that process?
Oh, again, really nice question, and also absolute pleasure to have you as part of our steering board. Just to be clear, Sally. So that's a really good question. So the first trial that I mentioned there, in terms of encouraging people to set up their safer gambling messages, what we were testing there was small changes to messages. So it was things like using a social norms message to encourage people to sign up to a product. So telling them what others, how their behavior compared to others. So telling them you're in the top 10% of people who spend most amount of time on the platforms. Here's a product that might help you spend a bit less time on the platform, for example. And what we saw there was, you saw some incremental increases or decreases in use. But where we've seen more substantive changes is where you change the actual choices, right? So rather than just a comms message, more comprehensive change. And so, for example, one of the things that we trialed a couple of years ago was redesigning what the deposit limit menu looked like when you were setting it. So usually if you went onto most of the websites in the UK a few years ago, you'd be presented with a drop-down menu. So it's like, I want to limit the amount of money that I want to put in place in my account. Here's a drop-down menu. And oftentimes would start with the highest value. And often that highest value would be about £100,000. So you could set a limit of £100,000 a week, a day, a month, right? Which I think for the vast majority of people, that isn't a helpful limit to set, right? It's not going to be particularly effective. So what we did was we ran a trial to compare that, so the business as usual, to 2 different designs. One of them was a very similar design, but we just changed the increments. So we had the max at £250, and you could select something higher, but there was friction in doing so. So you had to click a few buttons and type in a free text box. The second version just got rid of the drop-down menu and just had a free text box. So rather than prompting people with a figure, it got people to reflect a bit more on what worked best for them. And what we found was that the deposit limits that people set for themselves almost halved. So it wasn't 1 or 2 percentage points, it was a substantive reduction in that. So I suppose that's one example where I think you can have small changes around the margin by focusing on kind of like maybe smaller messaging changes, but you can have more comprehensive changes when you think about the choice architecture. I think we're also thinking about broader incentives, I suppose, for at a market level, how you could think about kind of the design of the market to inform various different incentives. But I suppose, yeah, that kind of gives you a flavour of the different ways that you can think about kind of behaviour change and how we've tested things.
Thank you. And it's really interesting research. And it's the other great thing about the Behavioural Insights team is all the research is made publicly available pretty quickly. So there's a huge emphasis on dissemination. Maris, you've got such a wealth of experience, which is so critical and rare because you have that combination of being an independent researcher, but having industry insights. And I know that in the gambling field, there is some contention of the extent to which the industry should be involved in research and policy. But I've always been of the view that it's important to understand the industry perspective, if only to know like where things are going and what sort of marketing and comms and, you know, what the customers are going to get, because, you know, that's what's going to happen. So it's interesting to understand the industry insights. But obviously industry know the customers, you know, in a totally different way, particularly to, you know, that sort of ivory tower academics where you don't necessarily even have to have ever spoken to someone to write a gambling paper. So, you know, industry have such a wealth of knowledge, but then there is that conflict obviously between, you know, commercial and marketing with corporate social responsibility, governments and licensing requirements. Now, Kindred is well known for having quite a strong emphasis on corporate social responsibility. So I was wondering if you could start by kind of talking through what is the aim of design and how is the balance, just from your experience, you don't have to speak to Kindred directly, but how should companies think about that balance between commercialization and making as much money as possible, but sustainability and customer care?
I'm not gonna say it was easy though, because when I started, I think I started in the RG role in 2011, where there was nothing. And I came into Kindred as a psychology student. You know, I was doing my master's in psychology, so technically speaking, it was meant to be like a temporary job. It wasn't something that I aimed to have as a career at the time. But I remember, you know, like I started as a fraud analyst and I started seeing all this data, all this information. And it was I was just so curious. And I remember like the first things that I started with was around markers of harm. So I wanted to do something on that topic. It was a bit too much for me to see people like self-excluding or getting really bad. Can the operator do something? And I'm not going to say that it was immediately, you know, bought in. And to do that type of research in a company like Kindred, and I think in any other company, is to keep in mind the sustainability factor. Keep in mind that, you know, although there are a lot of experts in the industry, most of the time they're experts in specific domains. So you have people who are experts in marketing, you have people who are experts more into how much they can get money out of people. But at the same time, through research, you can show how beneficial it can be. So I remember just a simple example. The first time I started looking into markers of harm, I looked into chasing losses. So I started looking into customers who were increasing constantly. And another marker of harm was people who are abusive to our customer service. And one major change that we saw was that when we were approaching people who were chasing losses, the abusive cases were getting lower. And there was no one actually who had looked into this relationship. And although obviously, you know, there were complaints like you're trying to stop certain customers from depositing more, why are you doing this? At the same time, because of this reduction in abusive communication, we had less people resigning. So it's finding the creative ways of showing, listen, if you're going for a quick win, don't do RG. But if you really want a sustainable relationship, do RG. And I still remember 2012, I think, when Kindred had two brands. They had Unibet and Maria. And I had launched the first version of this marker of harm detection. And I remember one of the commercial managers of Maria telling me, you're ruining us, you know, you have so many people self-excluding. The problem was that I was on my own and I was only doing this on Unibet. So I didn't know I had an A/B testing. It was just, you know, resources. I was on my own. There's so much coffee I can take. And I remember seeing the Maria stats and thinking like, okay, crap. if Maria is getting this bad, Unibet will be worse. But then we saw that there was a decline in self-exclusions. And in the long term, we saw that there was an uptake in limits, and this resulted in more money for the company. So it's just this change in the mentality of the operators. And to be fair, I've been lucky so far that every time I wanted to do research, there wasn't really anyone looking into this. There wasn't anyone from the Kindred group who would tell me like, no, don't research that or don't publish that. They were always very supportive because in their opinion, this is the data that we have. This is what we need. And then it was their pride as well, to a certain extent, that there was the company that was publishing this type of research.
I think that's really important insights to have, that this idea isn't necessarily about stopping revenue, but it's about making it a more sustainable revenue source, about preventing player burnout, that from an ethical point of view, there's some fairly straightforward things to look at, but even from a business point of view, and if we can sort of use research to make those cases that this is reducing, employee turnover, this is reducing customer complaints. I've had some operators come and say, well, we just want to reduce the number of people who complain to the government about us, because that's, I'm like, well, like maybe just, don't do harmful behaviors, or like that. Is that really your goal? But, you have to, and that's why it's important to have these insights, like, well, what is going to motivate an industry? And it's mentioned by Spencer Murch in the comments he picked up that, what do you have to do to demonstrate, to kind of cut those lines? And how do you decide, between like a default of just say putting a limit in place that's very low versus something like having a blank box that's going to reduce the limits? Like, what do you think where is the line between recognizing something as, more harmful, or making changes that are more subtle? And maybe Maris, you can give us a bit of insights, and again, not necessarily limited to Kindred, but any tidbits you've picked up from industry side of things. Is how do those conversations play out? You mentioned your one voice in the room. How do we, as if we're going to try and focus on getting this across the line, what sort of things we need to talk about?
I think the markers of harm aspect was a really good topic to start off with, because it's very proactive. So it's at an earlier stage, and as well, even to engage with the customer. Because if you have a customer who's lost so much money and then you go and tell him about limits, obviously he won't be receptive. But if you manage at an early stage, and also to get buy-in, not just from execs, but also from customer service, from the VIP teams, it really helps. I remember at one point we were getting so much information from the high net worth, so the people who were looking into customers that spend more money, and they were helping us and working hand in hand with the responsible gambling teams. So they would do the conversations and they would feel comfortable. And again, working with different stakeholders, it wasn't just to get the message across. I remember inviting treatment centers to the office, inviting people who had a gambling disorder to the office, to humanize it a bit more, because it can get to a point where it's a bit numbing for the operator. They just see an account number. But when they start seeing that, my actions can really have devastating effects, that was a huge shift. I remember in 2013, the first time he was Ian Semmel, he came to the office, he explained what he's been through. People started then, like every time they have a customer, they started, okay, I think this customer might have a problem. Let me try to help him. So they started seeing these things. When it comes to management, I presented different types of data. So, okay, a customer might go to the regulator, but also if a customer complains, you have a legal department working on it, you have customer service working on it, you have the RG team working on it. That's a lot of money. Is it worth it? Getting that mindset shift. And as well, for example, I remember when I wanted to do product blocking. So it wasn't a regulatory requirement anywhere, but I wanted to have the RG tool of product blocking. And obviously the first time people in the company were like, but why do we need another RG tool? Why are you pushing for this? And I think it's always by knowing your audience. I explained through data, we have poker players who are just blowing everything on casino and then self-excluding for 6 months. If we offer the option that they can block everything except poker. They're staying on board. So it's always trying to use the data to actually educate them and show them, listen, what we're doing the same thing. We're both teams are working on longevity. We're both working on the sustainable aspect. But obviously it's a bit challenging sometimes.
Definitely. And Aisling, can you tell us about the behavioural audit that the Behavioural Insights team conducted, where you looked across different real world examples of online gambling operators, and maybe touch on some of the key findings in terms of the best examples of, I guess, lower risk or sustainable or proactive consumer wellbeing practices, and potentially some examples you saw that, I know there are some things out there that have blown my socks off, and give us a few examples of some what I would actually call predatory practice, almost to the point where it's actually intentionally leading people to make choices that are not in their best interests.
Yeah, so interesting hearing kind of, Maris, your perspective on kind of like what it was like to be able to observe something and then dig a bit deeper in the data to kind of like have those, facilitate those conversations. So interesting, because I think one of the motivations that we had behind the behavioral audit that we did is that we didn't have that insight. So it was like, what could we glean from the outside? So what we did is we shortlisted the 10 top operators in the UK that operate online. And 4 of our researchers spent 6 weeks spending a lot of time like understanding the end-to-end user journey. So what we were able to do was look at what it was like to onboard compared to try and close your account. What was it like to place a bet? How easy or challenging was it to set a limit or deposit funds and things like that? And one of the things that we were really interested in was, did operators take up our recommendation about having a free text box? And what we found was the vast majority had not. So it was something like 8 out of the 10 had not implemented our recommendation, and even if they had, it was kind of half-heartedly done, I would say. So that was a really important observation for us to kind of highlight the point that even if you do have strong, robust evidence to say that this is a kind of has a clear impact on consumer protection, it's not so easy always to make the changes from the outside, I would say. That's the first thing. The second thing, I suppose, to answer your question, Sally, what were the kind of things that we found? So lots of interesting things. To give you, I suppose, a few of the kind of the 25 plus findings. So closing an account takes much longer than opening an account. What we found was about 6 out of the 10 operators, you had to contact customer service before you could close your account. And even actually 7 out of 10 of them, excuse me, I think it was 5 out of 10 of them, they essentially had a morsel account. So it was either incredibly easy to open them or incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to close them. And I think for people who maybe don't want to self-exclude, because that is quite a substantive kind of action to take, to say, can you please lock me out of all of these accounts for 6 months minimum? That feels like quite a large thing. In our view, making it difficult to close an account is an unnecessary barrier to someone that might just want to take a bit of a break. And to your point, Maris, I think that it's like that sustainability. I don't think that it helps that sustainability by impeding that choice. So that was one of the examples. Another example that we thought was really interesting was what you alluded to before, Sally, around the direct communications. So what were the email notifications or the push notifications that we were receiving? And we noticed that there was 2 things kind of surprisingly missing from any of it that was quite different from other retail sectors or service sectors, was that you didn't get any receipts for any of your deposits or any of your withdrawals, which again is just quite different to other retail sectors. So even that feedback and the kind of feedback loop on like how much you're spending is much more subtle and much harder to kind of to find. And Sally, I know that you've looked at this research quite a bit and thinking about how good people are at remembering how much they lost or how much they spent, and people are really poor at that. And I suppose our hunch is that not having things like receipts would make this even worse, but providing, for example, what the beta team in Australia are doing related to activity statements is one step forward in thinking about how you can provide that feedback. So that was one other example. Another thing, again, slightly different to other sectors, was didn't have security alerts if you logged in from another device, which, because we know how thoughtful and carefully designed the security features are internally at the operator side to make sure that there isn't any risk of money laundering, etc. But it was interesting to see that there wasn't quite that same balance for example, if someone was logging into your account and potentially being able to use your funds, for example. That was another finding. I suppose a third example was there were very few instances of prompts during gameplay about how much time you've spent or how much money you've spent. Some operators did have the functionality, but not all of them. So again, it's so easy to get lost in the moment and to not realize that, oh, how much have I just spent over the past little while, when it's just like one click kind of betting. So I suppose there were some of the interesting things that we found from the audit. And what we did after that was we made sure that all of the operators were very much aware of what we were about to publish, and we got really wonderful feedback. We've had like really collaborative discussions with operators, with policymakers, and with people with lived experience of gambling harm to shortlist and prioritize where we should kind of focus more attention and explore further through online experiments and field experiments where we might be able to reduce gambling harm even further. So we're exploring a bit more around areas related to feedback, as well as gambling management tools and how you might be able to kind of streamline them and provide people with kind of the best personalized information at their fingertips. And it goes to Spence's point earlier around the role of defaults and how you can feed that in based on, for example, the data that you have about customers to inform them of kind of what the best tailored product might be for them, for example, through gambling management tools or otherwise.
And I think just to add on to that, and it's something that I've been saying for quite a few years as well, is that I see a lot of the operators just have like an account history, which is really difficult sometimes to understand, even for someone like me who played and knows operators. And then you have like Swedish regulators who are pushing more for time limits. But in my opinion, the only way to get the gamblers to actually do limits that are good for them is to give this information clearly. And in fact, one of the exercises I had done once was I told during a training session, how much time do you think you spend on Facebook, to all the people who were in the room? And then I told them, okay, check on your app how much time. And you see that a lot of people minimized that time. And I think if this is actually portrayed properly on your gambling account, it will be so much better, because people tend to underestimate. So at least you have limits that are, still helping you gamble how much you want. And I don't know why. I think something with the industry, they're sometimes afraid to do these changes. They think that if they give more information to the customer, they're going to play less. But in all fairness, with what we're seeing with changes and stuff like that, is that people want to know. So why not show them, listen, okay, I gambled this much this month. My average across the months was £50. So let me set a £50 limit, rather than letting them guess. And to your point on mystery shopping, me and Mark actually did something similar with 50 operators across, like the most 50 advertised operators for a Maltese person. And we also see, like I went on live chat and I said, I think I have a gambling problem. And half of them were really difficult to convince them, just, that I need to close my account or give me the information. And I remember one of them, I got 22 commercial emails in 2 weeks after I said I have a gambling problem. Which, although a lot of the times you have operators saying, yeah, but that's not us. What they don't understand is that that operator is ruining the image of the others. So unless all of the operators try to work together on this, there won't be any, you know, the image is always getting worse. So why not try to use responsible gambling as a form of reputation management? Because otherwise you'll have people not gambling anymore because they only see it as a very negative activity because of this type of behavior, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think they're both really excellent points. And it's similar to what Mark Davies has put up in the chat here, that Australia has recently launched activity statements. So they're emailed out. So you have to still voluntarily open your email, but it has a clear net summary. So it's no longer, you know, the shopping list of transactions without a summary of what you're actually spending and losing. Although in my opinion, it could have gone a step further and actually had some level of analysis or synthesis associated with it. So it does show how your gambling has changed over the past few months. But I think it'll be even more useful to look at some of the examples from things like electricity usage or utilities to say, you know, do you know you're in the top 1% of spenders? Or have you noticed that your gambling has escalated 3 times? You know, this is a marker of harm. Why don't you set a deposit limit? Based on your recent transactions, your deposit limit should be. So some kind of way of packaging up and more targeted and tailored messaging to go from a just passive information to a specific action. So I think that's the interesting part of behavioral science, is it's non-judgmental, but it's providing a way to use information. So providing information back to people. But for me, behavioral science, the best applications of it are where it's very clearly prompting a behavior and making that easy for someone. Because if you just say, you know, oh, your gambling's escalated, do something about it, as opposed to here's a deposit limit and this is what you think it should, this is what it should be. Again, those principles, like you were saying, actually make it easy, reduce the friction. Here's the link right here. So all of these principles that you can put in place to assist someone to their desired behavior as an outcome. And I wonder if either of you have seen good examples of that, where good design has been applied, either in the industry or outside of the industry, that the gambling industry could learn from.
Outside of the industry, I really liked Revolut, for example. I don't know how popular it is in other countries, but you can see like a graph of how you're spending. Your spending is also segmented. So how much you spend on food, how much you spend pharmacy, and it also gives you an insight if you're spending more than usual and on which areas. And I think that's quite a good eye-opener. And although a lot of the operators that I speak to might be afraid to do this type of segmentation, when I remember that, you know, the responsible gambling experts were talking to customers about these topics, we never really had anyone who was unreceptive or abusive to it. I think the best relationships we built were with customers that were on the phone and discussing what type of limit they should set, or discussing that they need to self-exclude, which in the long term could have been a fine, or it could have been a legal case. But like this type of encouragement and the informed adult choice really helped in integrating this type of change and sticking to it as well.
No, really good question. So similar to your Revolut example, I've seen some really interesting things coming out of Bet Budget. So I think this is kind of an emerging app that takes a lot of the really interesting things from financial services, but specifically for gambling. So it gives you feedback on your spend patterns, etc. So I think that feels like a really exciting and interesting potential tool. But I suppose to your point, Sally, it's like I agree that I think with activity statements, I think step 1 is to give people information about what their behavior looks like. Step 2 is to try and unpick, well, what information going alongside that is most useful for people. Is it something like telling them what others are doing? Is it about saying how this impacts kind of their risk of harm, and comparing it, for example, with the lower risk gambling guidance, which is kind of specific guidance related to how many gambling activities that you play on a regular basis, how much of your disposable income you spend on a regular basis, and how much time you spend, for example. So one way that one thing that we're interested in doing is shortlisting some of those like candidates to kind of to try and overlay with this kind of feedback to explore again whether it will have an impact on how much people spend money and time wise, but also again to that point around sustainability of the customer base.
And I think that's a really important, and we've talked to then about like the type of information. We could talk for an hour about what information, how is it presented, how do we communicate with people and what do we say? But can we talk about timeliness? And I know part of it, both of you have looked at this idea of harms developing over time. Part of behavioral science is not just providing information or providing a tool, but thinking about when is the most relevant moment for behavioral change. And that's critical, because if you provide the right nudge or intervention, whatever you want to call it, which could be as simple as a design or a message, it's something like, easy, but if you provide it at the right time for the right people, then it can be much more impactful in terms of what outcome you're trying to achieve. So what do you guys think about what is the right time and who is the right target audience if we're looking at this idea of early intervention and prevention of harm?
Maybe like one very quick answer on this is, I think onboarding really matters. So at the point of setting up your accounts, prompting people to set a deposit limit at that point, I think is incredibly much more helpful than if people had to find it for themselves. So that habit formation, particularly onboarding, to me feels particularly helpful, in addition to using the data, the incredible data that operators have to assess risk in a kind of a live environment. And Maris, I'd say you have a lot of interesting things to comment on that.
I think it's twofold. So you have as well on the level of markers of harm that they're showing. So what I usually call like the low risk, like flirting with this. So in these type of situations, like on-site messaging, some messaging that can disrupt gameplay as well. I don't think it's bad because they're in the zone and you need to help them in that perspective. But in some cases, there needs to be a more intrusive intervention. So I remember that if there are cases that showed a lot of markers of harm, there would be actually a block on depositing until you can talk to one of the representatives, or you can have a personalized message. But as well, something that maybe not spoken enough about is the assessment of the intervention, whether it's good or not. Because at times you might have people, you do the pop-ups, you do the sliders, you do all this type of information, and they continue, extending this type of behavior and having like a stepped care approach. So you can keep record if someone was notified X amount of times, maybe now it's time to have a call. And calling customers, although it's something that a lot of operators are afraid of, I think it has a huge impact as well. Because every time that customers are called and there's that human intervention, it makes such a huge difference, in my opinion.
I think that what you raised about the potential unintended negative consequences is so important, because we're looking at channeling behavior, and what we know is that people do the darndest things, and that what you can be a very well-intended intervention. So even there's been some concerns about activity statements, maybe that's going to drive chasing losses because you're highlighting how much someone has lost. So are people going to chase losses after that? And things like having those automatic triggers. So for example, and how harsh do you set them? So if you start to say, okay, after you've made your first deposit, we're going to put a pause, and you can still make a second deposit, but there's going to be a 60-minute delay, or it's some kind of, strategy to try and introduce friction and slow things down, which might be incredibly helpful for people. But is it going to lead people to adapt to that and be like, well, I'm just going to put in a massive amount the first time because I know they're going to cut me off, and I found that really annoying last time. So how do you get around this conundrum of people some people are being helpful for, some people actually potentially making it worse? And then we know that, not all behavior is the same. So some person might look like a risk marker, but they're saying, well, I just make lots of deposits because that helps me decide how I go. So, how do we work with this framework and look for these unintended consequences and make these decisions on design?
I saw that there was some really interesting research related to this, but focused on social media. So in the US, there's a researcher called Hunt Alcott, and he was interested in a lot of kind of like the types of limits that are available in the gambling context, but in a social media context. So can you set a limit so that, you know, you only spend 20 minutes on your TikTok account a day, right? But what he was interested in is what happens at the point that you hit that 20 minutes, right? Because like, is 20 minutes realistic when you spend 3 hours a day on it, right? So it's like, how can you inform that? And what he found was that by giving people feedback, number one, on the amount of time and letting them kind of flex in the first instance, okay, I need a 30-minute to an hour limit a day for it to be actually useful for me, was one thing. But the second thing was that he also tested the impact of slight delays in reaccessing it, right? So let's say you hit your 20-minute cap and a thing comes up to say, you can override this, but you have to wait 2 minutes. Or you can override this, but you have to wait 5 minutes, or 20 minutes, or 30 minutes, or an hour. And what he found was even a 2-minute delay was enough to dissuade someone from trying to override it. So I think there's something really interesting there about kind of, even if there is kind of like a short amount of time that gets people out of that really kind of desperate urge to look at the next reel or whatever it might be, that can have quite a substantive impact. So yeah, I that feels like one area that could be quite interesting to explore further in the gambling space.
I think you need to have a balance though as well with the product offering, because if you're watching like a World Cup football match and you have that 2-minute delay and there's live betting, that would just drive someone to go somewhere else. And I think that is the fine balance that you need to achieve, because online gambling, there are so many websites. So as soon as there's a tech issue, I'll just go somewhere else. And it really depends on the customers as well. If they're playing, for example, imagine if you have a poker player and they get like a time limit and then it's 2 minutes, they're out of the game. Or if you have someone who's a live sports bettor and the game is almost finished and he wanted to play on penalties. So obviously in that case scenario, you are kind of missing out and you would go somewhere else, because that's what we see, you know. There is a lot of brand recognition, but then if it doesn't work, I'll just go somewhere else. And I think that is the fine line with gambling, that you need to keep in mind that it still has to be enjoyable, it has still to be a positive experience, but at the same time, not a reckless one. For example, a tool that I really liked was the reality check, reality check, I think in most jurisdictions, where you would have a pop-up. It tells you how much time you spend and how much money you've spent. But at least in that case, you can still continue gambling. So in those, the customer experience is not ruined, but at least you have a level of awareness.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's such a critical point, that we're not talking about, you know, a retail venue where it's going to take you 5 minutes, best case, to get out. And even if there's a place next door, you're fingertips away from accessing another website. So that is a really interesting point about trying to introduce friction, but being aware that there's a competitive landscape out there. But again, against the argument, oh, well, if they're just going to go somewhere else, so I'm just going to let them do irresponsible things at my site. So, and that competitive advantage of, can it be something that you want people to come to your site and work with you as an operator because you know they take consumer care seriously, versus, you know, throwing off customers so quickly that they're going to just work their way down to the shonkiest operators that we all know are well and truly happy to take money in the most predatory fashion. So I think that's such an interesting point to consider, is how can you, and I guess as well, thinking about behavioral science as a nudge, that we're not ultimately looking at being a policing necessarily. It's choice architecture. You know, how can we encourage people to reach for the apple instead of the candy bar? But it's not hiding the candy bar or taking the candy bar off the shelf necessarily. So, and then that's this particular tool. There's other tools that take candy away. But thinking about behavioral science in terms of how do we introduce friction and nudge behavior, but ultimately the individual for these particular sets of tools are making their own choices.
Yeah, I think that that's right. Yeah. So yeah, you want to make sure that this is person-centered. So I suppose the example I was given was more so someone chooses to set a limit that makes sense for them. And I think you're absolutely right. I really like that distinction, like around products and how that could really interfere in certain instances around sports betting. Totally hear you on that. But I suppose maybe where I was imagining it was more on like casino games or slots where it's so easy to be completely immersed in it and to lose that track of time. So yeah, I think and that kind of goes back to one of the loves of my life, around evaluation and experiments. So I suppose to your point, I suppose thinking about how you can trial, test, prototype things to see and be able to kind of ascertain, get the feedback from customers. Is it really irritating? Actually, do they not notice it? Do they find it really useful? I think that's where that kind of feedback is incredibly helpful.
And sometimes some products are really difficult to determine how much money you will lose. So if you go and play casino, for example, you can choose X amount of lines with a amount of money. And after you actually press spin, you realize that you lost all your money because the information is not clear. And it's done in a way to get people to lose more. And I think that is something that should be considered. The same way, like when you have losses disguised as wins, when you have, you just place €5, but you're winning 2, and you have all these streamers coming up. That is kind of, to a certain extent, not the real type of information. And it also goes on the product level, in my opinion, that there should be better information there for the gambler to realize what they're doing.
And I think and I remember having a conversation years ago now at a Canadian conference with some people from a different industry group than Kindred, and saying, "Oh, I'm going to design this study and I'm going to plan it. I'm going to submit the methodology. I'm going to get ethics approval, and then I'm going to run the study with participants recruited from the community. And then, a year later, I'm going to have results." And they kind of sat there and went, "Oh, we can just mock those messages up and have results for you in 2 days from now." So like the speed at which you can do testing when you have the participants, and the industry can try out some of these things. And the message I say to an industry, if you're afraid of doing it, just do a little tiny pilot and see what happens. Test it out, see maybe it's not as bad. Do a watered down version. Typically things aren't quite as catastrophic as, customers are probably not even going to notice. So maybe you can just briefly, to finish off, it's a question I like to ask people, is for someone starting out in this field or someone interested in doing some research, or whether they're in a treatment group or a policy area, if you're interested in starting to apply behavioural science to reduce gambling harm in whatever line of work, if you're industry or community or researcher, where would you both recommend that someone might be able to start or do something to start collecting knowledge and adding value?
Well, I was waiting for you to answer first, hoping that you have an answer to this. I mean, working with an operator can be lovely for a researcher, but prepare that you have a lot of thoughts that you want to strangle a few people. It's not that easy. The data is impressive, but as well, you will have to do a lot of change as well. And overall, the industry, I don't think, is always ready for these changes. So you will get a lot of questions about a specific RG message, how it's done, but then you see marketing schemes that are not being assessed about their effectiveness. So how to start? I always liked saying academia, but working with the industry is beautiful, but can be really, really difficult as well. So
thank you for going first. Maybe two reflections. I suppose one is you have to be ready for complexity, because as Mara said, it is incredibly complex, and even to infer the impact of something can be quite difficult. So that's the first thing. But with that, it's so interesting because it's almost kind of this like knotty problem that's so satisfying when you kind of like unravel it. That's one thing that I'd mention. And I suppose like spending some time on the ground, whether it's on the platforms, speaking to people who gamble regularly, going to the footy and seeing kind of what that looks like, going to the races, seeing what that looks like in terms of kind of the gambling context. I think that lived experience of what it's like to be a gambling customer, etc., I think is incredibly helpful to inform where you think there could be opportunities for change.
I think that's such an important point. This behavioral science is not something that can be done in isolation. You cannot read a bunch of academic articles and then apply them and say, I know people are going to do X because, this previous research study did it. So I would encourage anyone, whether it's, if you have access to do any research, and behavioral science really does involve research, and that doesn't have to be in an academic context, but some level of evaluation is really critical. But you can do mock-ups, and Aisling, you've done work with mystery shoppers. You don't have to have access to industry or industry data. You can just get consumers. You can do focus groups. You could do pilot testing. It is really an accessible methodology, and there's lots of information, and you can start small. So I think I'd like to encourage people to think about it not as being in an inaccessible way to start, to looking at these principles that you can apply to whatever methods you're using. If you're working in the sort of gambling and gambling harm reduction field, to start learn a little bit and think about how you can apply some of these principles of, make it easy, make it simple, make it attractive, make it relevant, make it timely, how we can start to tweak what are we trying to achieve, and thinking through even those principles. Just work out, what are you trying to achieve? What is the behavior, as opposed to just, I'm trying to reduce gambling harm. Get more specific and granular and start thinking, what specifically do I want to achieve? How am I going to get that behavior? And kind of, I think it's a really accessible framework for people to use. I want to thank you both, and I'm hoping you're going to wrap up by giving us any inklings into something that's in the pipeline, either for you or that you think should be, what's the future here, and you can share something you're working on or something that you'd love to work on. What's next here in the gambling field in behavioral science?
Happy to jump in first. So yeah, one thing I'm really excited about is some work that we're hoping to publish in a few weeks' time, where we've had a look at Meta's ad library of live adverts related to slots in the UK, and done quite an in-depth analysis, kind of unpicking the features of the ads I suppose to learn a bit more about kind of what marketing and advertisements looks like in the UK. So that's something that I'm particularly excited about in the coming weeks.
With me, it's mostly the more standardization and cohesiveness between operators around the markers of harm, and seeing more operators looking into this and trying to be preventive rather than too reactive, and embracing finally this type of approach.
Yeah, and I like that idea of what you said, Maris, that this isn't a competition. This should be something that operators have universal strategies, and if we can start to have collaboration across operators, and I think a lot of it is normalizing customers to these sorts of changes, that I just have a 2-minute delay and I'm going to go to the next site and that's going to give me a 2-minute delay. If that starts to normalize that experience and people start to think, okay, like this is just what happens, and understand that this is about, maybe I don't have a gambling problem, but it's helpful for someone else. So the more that these sorts of behavioral science changes become normalized for individuals, I do think it's going to shift. And the other thing I would say is that it's not intended to be a panacea. There's no way that changing a box from a drop down to a blank text, that's not going to solve a gambling problem. So I also think we need to keep it into perspective, and that we know that the gambling recovery process is very long-term and cyclical, that we're not looking at, I got that activity statement, I am totally over this now, I'm changing my whole behavior. And think about it as every intervention as a step, as like a nudge, as some friction, helping that individual along their path. So that's kind of, I guess, what I would think of as encouraging this. But I want to thank you both so much. I know how late it is. Thank you. The audiences are incredibly appreciative of your expertise. Both Maris and Aisling's profiles are up online. Please do reach out and connect with them. And a huge thank you to both of you for being involved in the Technology Risk and Gambling webinar series.
Well, that was an awesome seminar, and honestly, I have a little bit of PTSD to my time as a responsible gambling operator, because thinking through these problems were like the most taxing things. So thank you both for not only this webinar, but also helping to clarify, a lot of things for a lot of people out there who are, trying to work through these problems in real time. Next week, Sally, how would you describe the session that we have going on next week? We have a few international experts coming on.
Yeah, I have again picked my brains trust from the Anti-Illegal Betting Council of the Asian Racing Foundation, and we're going to be looking at crypto, illegal betting, cybercrimes, and the kind of the finance end of gambling online and potentially nefarious gambling. Yeah,
so another interesting session coming up next week, but for this week, it's time to wrap up. So allow me to say thank you to our guests again today. Thank you, Sally, for moderating the session. Thank you to Herschen Stein, who's behind the scenes, as always, at the Brain and Mind Center, who are hosting this webinar series. So with that, thank you, and we'll see you again next week.